So hello, I'm Joshua Shanes. I live here in Skokie, but I am a professor of Jewish history at the University of California, Davis. And as I was just telling your previous speaker, I'm from Chicago. My wife works here at Northwestern, and I drew the short straw to get mileage status. So I fly back and forth to teach my classes. And my area of expertise is modern nationalism, and particularly within Jewish history. And I've been doing this for about 35 years now, as you can tell from my bald head. My understanding is what I was asked to speak about is a little bit about religious Zionism as a kind of connection to what you're talking about. And I'm going to get there in a sort of roundabout way. And I'm speaking now as a scholar. I'm not an activist. I'm not a rabbi for sure. But I'm rather a scholar and academic. And so that's sort of my approach to things. And there's different ways of approaching topics that academia has certain advantages and disadvantages, as every field does. In 1967 or so, there was a scholar named Robert Bellah who wrote a very, very important article, which all of you can find online on Google, called American Nationalism as a Civil Religion, or some such thing. And there he explains how American nationalism works as a kind of ersatz religion. You know, if religion tells you who is in the holy community and who's on the outside, and what are the holy days, and what are the holy holy places, and what are the rituals expected of you, and what's your sacred past, and what's your destined future. Well, nationalism does all of that, right? It tells you all of those things. And it was a very, very important article that really created a whole field of study thinking about nationalism in this way, right? Because if we are thinking about religious nationalism, in a sense, every nationalism is a kind of religious nationalism. Now, sometimes it dips more deeply into the texts and traditions of existing religions, and sometimes it's more in rebellion against them. But they're all a kind of religion. Now, his student, Robert Wuthnow, said to his master, his teacher, I hear what you're saying, very important observation, very important insight. But if you think about it, there's actually multiple versions of American civil religion, right? And he says for example, I see a conservative one and I see a liberal one. And they're both civil religions, separate from Christianity or Judaism or Islam or anything else. They're both civil religions. But for example, the conservative one is thinking a lot more about American exceptionalism, a lot more about Judeo-Christian, whatever the hell that means, a lot more about whiteness probably, a lot more about privilege. Capitalism will be part of that one, and America is the city on the hill, that kind of thing. Whereas liberal civil religion will dip more into Isaiah, Micah, Genesis 1, right, those sorts of texts. And they'll have a vision of humanism, they'll have a vision of America helping out the world, but also framed as American nationalism. If you want to see an example of this, I show my students often, go watch, on the eve of Biden's inauguration in 2021, go watch the speech of Reverend Barber he gave the night before at the cathedral. And it is a prime example of liberal civil religion. It's really remarkable. And then watch the prayer at the RNC that summer when they nominated Trump. The previous summer, I should say. You'll see what I'm talking about instantly. It's quite clear. They're both forms of civil religion. So, in response to the talk we had before about the long talk about Christian nationalism, it was very, very important. I don't see the speaker here. Sorry, right in front of me. I'm looking around. I agree with almost everything, but I'll say two things that I think I would not disagree with exactly, but sort of frame differently. One is a small point, but I'm a very pedantic person, which I explain to my children means annoyingly precise. Replacement theory is not the theory that we need to replace dark people with white people. It's the theory that white people are being replaced by dark people, and we have to fight against that. And why it's very important, because there's a whole theology about replacement. And why it's important to me as a scholar of Jewish studies is, if you read great replacement theory theology, Jews are behind it. It's always connected to anti-Semitism. So they'll name George Soros, or they'll name Israel, or they'll name whatever. But there's always a conspiracy of Jews behind it. Which is why when Robert Bowers in 2017, whenever it was, wanted to stop the replacement of white people with Latinos from Central America, he went to a synagogue in Pittsburgh and shot at, the worshipers, because the Jews are behind replacements. That's the only reason I make that point. Although you're right about the goal of fighting replacement is obviously correct. And the other thing I would say, and this goes back to Robert Wuthnow, is, people often say that Christian nationalism, and I agree what you said about it, it's the threat, its power currently, and everything it stands for. I wouldn't call it a fake religion. Or that wasn't the word you used. You used, you had some word. I don't remember what it was. It wasn't fake. But my point is, it's another version of religion. If you want to make a Christianity, I know Judaism best, so let's talk about Judaism. If you want to make a Jewish version that is based in humanism and, all sorts of, repairing the world and all sorts of wonderful things, it's very easy to do it. Most Judaisms do that, right? You have Genesis 1, so we're all made in the image of God. You have Micah. You have Isaiah. You have 38 times that the Pentateuch alone repeats that you have to take care of the widows and the orphans. I mean, there's a million texts you can lean on. But if you want a text that talks about supremacy and genocide, I mean, that's there. You cannot deny the book of Deuteronomy. We read it in synagogue this Saturday morning, where God talks to the Israelites under first under Moses, under Joshua, how they're going to clear the land of the people who are there. It calls for genocide. And when they spared the women and children, this was 2 weeks ago, Moses was furious. How could you spare the women and children? What the hell is wrong with you? You kill every one of them. He says, but the boys, the men, the women, all killed. But the girls who are still virgins, those you can take for sex slaves or for wives, right? So I'm just saying, you can if you want to build Christian nationalism, I just don't think it's helped. And the reason, again, I don't think I'm being pedantic, is because if you want to fight Christian nationalism, it won't work to say it's not a religion, because it is. They're just choosing different sources than you and me. So I think the way we do it is the way Reverend Barber does it, which is to say you're looking at the wrong sources. You can do that, but I prefer to look at Micah and Isaiah and Genesis 1. That's my view anyway. That's an I statement. That's my own personal take. That the way to fight Christian nationalism or any kind of, or Hindu nationalism that's supremacist, or Zionist forms that are supremacist, I think the way to do that is to say, you can do that if you want, but I think it's immoral. To lean in on the book of Joshua is simply immoral. It's a terrible book. It's an awful book, right? I really prefer Micah. It's a lovely book, right? What does God want of you? Walk with God and you give charity. Like that's where it's at. Anyway, let's talk about Zionism for a few minutes. So here's the thing. Pre-modern Jewishness was not a religion and it was not a nation. There were no nations back then, right? It was some sort of a people, some sort of an ethnic group. And there was a completely pre-modern, traditional, unself-reflective. But in the modern world in the 1800s, Jews started getting emancipated. It was a caste system in feudal Europe. I'm sure you all know. Nobody had equality. It was, feudal. But when they moved to a modern nation state model, Jews were slowly emancipated. And the condition of their emancipation was that they would give up their corporate identity. They'd become a religion. And the Jews who made that offer mostly accepted it. It was a good deal, right? They were given freedom. They were offered freedom. But then they had to figure out what it meant to be Jewish. They had to pick and choose texts, the same as everyone in this room does. Every one of you picks and chooses. I pick and choose. Every one of you picks and chooses. So they had to pick and choose. So they construct a kind of Protestant Jewishness, a kind of religion, right? I'm a Jew on the street. I'm a man on the street, but a Jew at home, right? On the street, I'm just a German. I'm an American. I'm an Englishman. I'm a French, whatever. But at home, in the synagogue, I'm Jewish. That's my religion. Whether it's Reform or Orthodox or something in between, it doesn't matter. It was a religion. In Eastern Europe, for a variety of reasons, that's where most Jews lived at the time, it didn't work. That wasn't going to work. I can't get into why, but trust me, it didn't work. And so what happens instead, as Jews leave this corporate identity and become modern, they move to Jewish politics. Socialism, liberalism, orthodoxy is a kind of politics, and different kinds of Jewish nationalism, of which one branch was Zionism, of which has many branches in itself. And what that branch said was, Jews, just like around us, you have all of these new peoples getting national identity for the first time, right? Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Poles, Romanians, all these people were getting nationalized by a nationalist elite as part of the process of the age. Jews adapt the same idea and say, if we pick and choose from our past, then the past shows us to be a nation also, right? And there's lots of sources that you could lean on to create a kind of Zionist Judaism. It's no less or more authentic than any other kind. I mean, if you want to lean on connections to the land, if you want to lean on nationhood, if you want to lean on symbols, you have to reinterpret them. But that's what we're all doing all the time. This is a church that's pretty progressive. I'm guessing you all reinterpret Leviticus 18. I'm guessing, right? So we all do this all the time. So they did it too. And as the old Seinfeld joke goes, if you remember the episode, not there's anything wrong with that. We all do it, but I'm going to call it out because I'm an academic and not a rabbi, so I can call it out. Now, this kind of Zionism, so the idea was Jewishness is about nationhood, right? Now, for most of them, the land, it wasn't even that important. But for the minority that it was, that was the goal of Jewishness. And they had texts on whom to rely. Now, they were an overtly secular movement. Actually, for the first few decades of Zionist history, most Jews rejected Zionism on religious grounds because you were supposed to wait for the Messiah to come before you tried to. The religion said someday Jews are going to return to the land. Messiah in Judaism is not about salvation, it's about redemption to the land. But it's going to happen when God says so. So this was a secular idea saying we're not going to wait for God. Maybe we don't believe in God. Maybe we think God wants us to do this, right? Because just like, I don't know, God heals, but we go to doctors, right? So they thought that's kind of thing. Whatever it was, they were secular. But there was a small group that we call religious Zionists. And they had to square a circle. They had to say, I know this seems to be a rebellion against a traditional messianic passivity, but it's not. It's not a rebellion. Actually, this is what Judaism wants us to do. We're not secular rebels like the other Zionists. Now, there's different versions of religious Zionism that come about. They're all very unimportant at first. In the first decades of the Zionist movement, they're not the ones who made the state of Israel. They had almost no significance in Palestine whatsoever, and almost no significance in Israel after it was founded in 48 whatsoever. Only decades later, as a result of religious political forces, birth rates, and other sorts of things, and especially as a result of the 1967 war, when Israel conquers, among other places, the West Bank, which is the heartland of biblical Judaism. It's funny, actually. Judaism and Jewish nationalism is far more interested in the West Bank sites. But Palestinian nationalism, as far as I understand it, is far more interested in the coastal sites, actually. So you almost want to sort of switch them and then make everybody happy. But that's not a popular opinion. Anyway, so there are different ways of approaching religious Zionism. One of them is to say, oh, we're not actually making the Messianic state. We're just trying to get out of Europe. After all, Europe is going to be quite a dangerous place for Jews. The Holocaust hadn't happened yet, but anti-Semitism was quite violent and severe. Another possibility is to say, actually, it's like the person going to the doctor, right? God heals, but you're supposed to go to the doctor. God will bring us to the land, but we have to do what we can. So if we can go to the land, we should go to the land. Nobody thought about Arabs, Palestinians, almost nobody. For a variety of reasons, some racist and some historical. But that was the ideology behind it. We want to think about Zionisms, plural, as a kind of civil religion, and we want to think about it in two senses, right? We want to think about, by the way, today religious Zionism is still a spectrum of ideas. There are conservative versions and there are liberal versions. So there are conservative versions that are very closely ultra-Orthodox and that they are very patriarchal. And they are, they shun humanist liberalism, they shun university education, and all that kind of thing. And you have very liberal forms of religious Zionism, that they are ordaining women rabbis, which in Orthodox world is about as progressive as you can imagine, right? They are having gay acceptance. They are, they are accepting biblical criticism, which is a very big, that means that the Bible is written by human beings. That's a very, very big deal. So you have these split in the religious Zionist world today, but not about the land. That's the one value they don't split about. There is a movement of which I'm a member called the religious small muni, like the faithful left, which are people who want to be religious and are effectively Zionists, although I'm not, but many of them are. But they also reject what has happened to the religious Zionist world that's become so obsessed with settlement and land and domination. There is such a movement. If you Google well, you wouldn't remember the Hebrew, but there's a movement called the religious left that's trying to do something about that. But for now, they're very much a minority movement. I think what we have to think about living in the diaspora as we do, living outside of the land, and when it comes to Zionism, is to think about it in two terms. One term is a kind of civil religion. the vast majority of Jews know about as much about Israel-Palestine as you all do. Which is to say, probably not that much, no offense, but like, you all have lives. Like, you're lawyers and doctors and all sorts of other things and pastors and, you know, this is not your life. You don't spend every morning until, you don't wake up at 5 in the morning, as I do on my phone, reading 2 hours of Israeli news, and then, you know, go to sleep at 2 a.m. with your wife yelling at you to turn off the damn phone because you don't want to miss what happened in the morning in Israel. So that's fine. Why are they Zionists then? What does that mean? I think for most of them, their Zionism, I'm sorry, I'm a pacer for your camera, I apologize. For most of them, what Zionism is just a form of Jewishness, like Jewish ethnic pride. Like, I'm a proud Jew. I know you don't see it. You know, I don't wear a kippah. I don't keep kosher. I don't keep the Sabbath so strictly. Maybe my spouse isn't Jewish. Whatever it is, I know you don't see it. But they're saying to you, I'm a proud Jew. And Zionism is that. And by the way, always was that. If you read my first book, it's what my first book was about, even in Europe. It was about a way of being Jewish and proud of being Jewish without the burdens of traditional religious rituals. But then there's Zionism as enacted in the state, right? And that it could have gone differently. There were Zionists in the 30s and 40s who were binationalists. Very famous people, by the way. Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, Judah Magnus. These are like giants in Jewish history of the early 20th century. And they were binationalists. They said this land is Jews and Palestinians. Yep.
You may want to explain what binationalist.
Oh, sorry, thank you. A binationalist means, thank you, somebody who says this land is filled with Jews and Arabs. It should be a democracy for both nations, right? Which is sort of the way we're going, I think, now because of the settlements. But they wanted this back then. I mean, I don't mean the state, but I mean the movement for freedom. No, the state's not going that direction. But Israel could have gone that way, and it didn't. And there are reasons why it didn't. Understandable reasons and offensive reasons. The Holocaust had a lot to do with it. The Holocaust turned a lot of people. But in any event, so there's Zionism in terms of identity, in terms of civil religion, a kind of Jewishness, like a denomination, right? And then you have Zionism as enacted in the state, which, as history has gone, has not been pretty. It's been awful. And I think it's useful for us thinking about religious nationalism and thinking about Zionism, thinking about how we act as activists, activists who are, involved, as I see from the signage here, in freedom and equality, to think about that distinction. It seems to me on the college campuses that I visit that there's often people talking past each other. Right? On the one hand, you have people screaming at some Jew, and that Jew might be religious like me or might be a Zionist with an Israel shirt, free Palestine. They have nothing to do with Palestine or Israel. They're just some Jew. That's how they're Jewish, right? It'd be as if you saw a proud Irish Catholic during the time of troubles and you said, whatever side you were, I forget who's on which side. It's all very confusing to me, but like, they're just a proud Irish American, right? They don't know from Ireland, and they probably know less about that conflict than you do. So and then on the other hand, you see Zionists who they see a free Palestine and they say, you're attacking my Jewishness, you're an anti-Semite. Why? Because they don't realize, and hopefully you are being careful, that you're talking about a state. You're talking about a place and an ideology as enacted in that state. And you're not saying they can't be Zionists in terms of their proud Jewishness. You're saying, I'm opposed to how Zionism is happening on the ground in Israel, Palestine. And I think that I see that crossed, people missing each other so often. And the biggest advice I tell people when they want to, either if they're on the side of wanting to protest against Israel, or if they're on the side of I don't like those protests, I say focus on what they're focusing on. That a protest should be thinking about Zionism as enacted in the state, not as a civil religion of people living in diaspora trying to just be Jewish because that's all they know. Now, there is a growing movement of young Jews who do not want to be Jewish that way. It's still pretty small, I got to tell you. I think Gaza has made a huge push. I mean, Gaza is just unlike anything, as you all know, right? It's unlike anything that's happened in the last 50, 75, 100 years. We're in new ground here. So I think that's going to have some difference. Those of you who think I saw the flyer, which had some correct, I saw the myths and facts flyer. I read it with interest. I agreed with 80% of the myths and facts, which is to say, I think it exposed some good myths with some good facts. They're over there under there.
Ilan Pape's 10 myths.
Yeah, Ilan Pape is I think it's useful. So I tell my students when they make arguments, not to make straw man arguments, right? Meaning to say, if you want to argue against someone and you're going to give their argument to argue against them, give the best version of the other person. That's what you're supposed to do, not the worst version. I know that's not what politicians do, but we should do that, right? We should strive to do that. This flyer had a few things. The one that caught my attention was Jews lived mostly with equality in history. That's a whopper. I'm not saying that Jewish suffering justifies one iota of the crimes against humanity happening, but that's just not historically true. It's like we don't need to make up facts. It's like when people fight Trump and they just make things up. I'm like, dude, there is so much. You don't have to make anything up, right? You don't have to fat shame. You don't have to there's a literal fascist movement going on. You really don't have to make things up. So anyway, and I'll say one last thing. The comment you made that I liked the best about Zionism was you called it a particularly violent form of Zionism. That's so important, right? It is a particularly violent form. It's a mixture of secular right-wing sort of fascist Zionism with religious Zionism, that literally the government. But that's one form. Is it the only form that might have it's the form that happened. And I reject people who say, oh, we should separate the government from the state. It was a popularly elected government among Jewish Israelis. By the way, one of the things that thinks that's wrong is Palestinians can't be citizens. Most Palestinians can't be citizens. There is about a quarter of them are citizens. That's also, again, no need to exaggerate. The truth is bad enough. But in any event, it was a popularly elected government, so you can't separate. But it was one form, as you said. There are other forms out there, including binational forms, that I think we need to nurture and rediscover. There are 7 million or 7.5 million Jews and 7.5 million Palestinians living in that land. And no matter, they're not going anywhere. So we need to figure out some sort of binational way of living together. And I think focusing on some forms. And I'll end with this, actually. One of the things that I know I'm very scatterbrained, I apologize. One of the things I tell my students, it's called a fundamental attribution error. If you don't know what that is, Google it. Fundamental attribution error. Raise your hand if you ever heard of what this is. I'm just curious. 1, 2, 3 of you. I bet these 3 agree with me that it's very important. It's what you do when you say, the easiest way to explain it is when you say, the worst version of my opponent defines them, but the worst version of me is an exception, right? It happens all the time. And we have to avoid that error. That's a logical fallacy we have to avoid. Sorry?
By their worst action, we judge ourselves by our best intention.
Exactly. Well said. Exactly. Yeah, we judge others by their worst action, ourselves by our best intention. So, it's like Zionists. Well, it's Netanyahu and the religious Zionists. That's not who we are. Like, well, I mean, there are opponents. There's a strike today in Israel to shut them down, but they were popularly elected. I mean, you can't quite say it's not us, right? And likewise, on the other side, they say, all Palestinians are Hamas. I'm like, okay, Hamas exists. It's a thing. But, you've done the attribution, right? We're not Netanyahu, but you're Hamas. Or we're not Hamas, but you're Netanyahu. You have to be a little bit more nuanced, I think, to have a conversation, it seems to me. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions on anything that I touched on but didn't explain. Okay, thank you all. I'll refill my water. Yeah.
I'm usually a loud person, but maybe I'll preserve some energy if I use the mic. My name is Tarek Khalil. I am the education coordinator with American Muslims for Palestine. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. What a wonderful gathering. I learned a lot from the prior speakers, and so many thoughts are going through my head. After all the speakers finished, I forgot how I wanted to start this thing. I had something in mind. And now I want to respond to so many things and have an interesting back and forth, but I'll leave that to the end and just focus on the core point that I wanted to bring here. Obviously, we've all witnessed, and just as a quick aside, at the end of this, what did you call it, Paula? The I what is it? I statement. I'm gonna have a few of those, but. Right now, I just really want to ground what's happening in Gaza in its proper history, because what we've seen in our mainstream press and in Western press is the utter dehumanization of the Palestinian people. And let me just say this to you. Actually, I'll start with one I statement. If what is happening in Gaza is considered the norm in today's society, I really don't want to live in this world. This should not be normal. We shouldn't have to wake up and see 68 children killed, 70 killed, 20 killed, 1 killed on a daily basis and say, oh, that's just the new tomorrow. Just like we've normalized the occupation, the generalized oppression of Palestinians, we've normalized that. Since 1967, spent 5-6 decades, 77 years of dispossession, okay. Palestinians continue to live in refugee camps, denied their right to return. We've just accepted it, just the way it is. Genocide, the first few weeks were just terrible. Thousands of people on the streets protesting. And now that the number has reached 60,000+, I would say by the time this all ends and we pull everybody from under the rubble, you're looking at somewhere in the 6 figures in terms of total dead and wounded. And now it's less of an issue. It's still on the news, but it's not capturing that mainstream attention as it once did. And that is why it is my job as a Palestinian, as an educator, to make sure that I tell my people's story and that it's understood in its proper context. And to give a little bit of news to Americans obviously you live in this country, to Americans as civics in this country. You have the utmost duty of any country in the world. There's 197 nations in the world. This country, because we are contributors, all of us, to the genocide of a defenseless civilian population. Whether you like it or not. I'm not saying we're complicit. The administration's complicit. But we are contributing with our tax money, me included. And it sickens me to my soul that that is the case. But I want to take you on a brief journey into Gaza so that we properly pick the right departure point of analysis with respect to Gaza. And I have breaking news. It's not October 7th. That is what has been presented as the departure point of analysis. And I will spend just a little bit of time talking about the H word, because that has been all over the news. Hamas. Do you all know that it's actually an acronym? Who knows what Hamas stands for? حركات المقاومة الإسلامية, the Islamic resistance movement. Now let's think conceptually, let's think logically. Would a resistance movement have a purpose to exist were there nothing to resist? Instead of talking about the fundamental issue that brought about such a resistance, we're here focusing on the byproduct as opposed to the root cause. So I want to spend time on the root cause. And the root cause is Zionist settler colonialism. And I know that we've heard about Zionism, and I'll talk about my response maybe throughout this or at the end of this. I did want to preface it by saying this. The Zionism that Palestinians, if there are forms, and we'll get into the forms and all of that, but the only form of Zionism that I as a Palestinian care about is the Zionism that we and my people encountered. And that Zionism is settler colonial at its core, violent at its core, not violent and some non-violent. It was violent at its core. And it set the stage for the ethnic cleansing and the eventual takeover of Palestine. The founding father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, wrote in his book, The Jewish State, Judenstaat, and in his diaries. And he called it, especially in his letter to Cecil Rhodes, who was the brainchild of Rhodesia, a colonialist, said, this is not Africa, and I know that you are used to Africa and colonizing Africa. This is Asia Minor. But why should you feel affinity to this? He said, I quote, because it is something colonial. And you can relate to that. And we can relate to that. That's the founding father of Zionism. And if you look at the writings of other founding fathers of Zionism, Max Nordau, Israel Zangwill, Zev Jabotinsky, Leo Pinsker, all of them preached the same verbiage, except some had a little bit of a softer tone. But in its essence, Zionism was a settler colonial movement. So I actually want to present to you a definition of Zionism. I didn't make this up. I'm looking at the writings of the founding fathers of Zionism and other Zionists, Ben Gurion, and what are called the elder statesmen of Zionism that came after, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Shamir, Yitzhak Rabin, and of course the modern day Likud party under Benjamin Netanyahu, who actually, the mentor of his movement, the founder of his movement, the Likud, was Zev Jabotinsky, who wrote what is known as he wrote the article, The Iron Wall. And he was very big on domination, that word that we heard, which is basically the essence of apartheid, by the way, but that's a separate topic. Gaza, how does Gaza feature in all of this? We talk about the refugee population of Palestine. 750,000 were ethnically cleansed between 1947 and 1949. 200,000 of that number were driven into Gaza. That is why the refugee population today in Gaza is approximately 80%. Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump want to talk about transferring, euphemism for ethnic cleansing, obviously, the Palestinian. And by the way, that's the same notion that was used by the early Zionists as well, to hide the violent nature of Zionism. Theodor Herzl himself said in his writings, we must spirit the penniless population. How do we do this? We can try to bribe them, we can try to buy land, but eventually the Zionist movement understood that buying their way through it was not going to be enough, and that is why in 1947, the Zionist Jewish land ownership in Palestine was less than 7%. So they realized that in order to achieve our designs, we must remove the native population. So Palestinians, 200,000 of that number were driven into Gaza. Now let me focus on Gaza. From 1948 to the early 50s, a shoot-to-kill policy. We're seeing today in Gaza, right? That existed back then too. This is not a new phenomenon. This is not a post-October 7th phenomena. This is a Zionist phenomena. What we're seeing is an intensification of an already existent oppressive structure that has existed for the last 77 years. A shoot-to-kill policy. Make sure that you don't let any single refugee return to their homes, return and retrieve their belongings, return and settle their native lands. We must capture their land, deny refugees from returning, and shoot to kill anyone that dares to come through. And then throughout the 50s, massacres were committed. We're seeing massacres today, right? Massacres were committed in the 1950s as well. Ariel Sharon, who's ever heard of him? Do you know what Palestinians call him? The butcher of Palestinians. If you don't know why I'm saying that, look up Sabra and Shatila and you'll see what I'm talking about. But in the 50s, committed massacres in Khan Yunis, committed massacres in Al-Buraish, committed massacres in Rafah under his secret unit 101 where he was the general commander. You may think, well, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. They would never have someone like that take political office again with those types of massacres on his resume. Oh, no. That's exactly why. You will move up in the ranks because of your brutality, because of your violence. And from the 1950s all the way to the 60s, a truce was formed. And now Palestinians were relegated to the refugee camps. And in 67, Israel eventually conquered the rest of historic Palestine and put the Palestinians under a military occupation. Now, we did hear earlier that, we have to present a little bit of nuance. In what is modern day Israel, there are Palestinian citizens. That's true, citizens. Rights under Israeli law flow not from your civic relationship to the state, but your national belonging in the state. National rights supersedes civil rights, supersedes civic rights. So while Palestinians are citizens of the state, they are not nationals of the state. There's only one nationality in Israel, Jewish nationality. And that is why the parastatal organizations the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish National Fund, the Jewish Agency. These organizations work at the behest not of the citizens of the state, but Jewish people. If you read the charter of the Jewish National Fund, it says we must keep the land for Jews in perpetuity, not for Israeli citizens, for Jews. You can be a Jew in Poland, you can be a Jew in Russia, you can be a Jew in Belarus, you can be a Jew in New York, it doesn't matter. You have supra-constitutional status vis-a-vis the state. But the Palestinian citizen, whose grandfather and grandmother and great-grandfather and great-grandmother and their entire lineage comes from Palestine, they are of a second and third class status. So in Gaza, now it's even a fourth and fifth class status, because now you're living under military occupation. So you can have some freedom of movement, but you must accept your position in that status. If you reject and you oppose that, by any means, we'll make it even worse for you. And that's exactly what happened. In the 1980s, the first Intifada erupted. And Yitzhak Rabin, the so-called liberal dove, you know how we talked about forms of Zionism? Yitzhak Rabin was considered the left. He was the dove. Yitzhak Rabin, the liberal Zionist, instituted what is known as the bone-crushing policy against the Palestinians who dared to resist, who dared to respond, to express their opposition to the military occupation. And as a result, Yitzhak Rabin and the Israeli government tightened its control, its grip over Gaza, revoking the general exit permit. Now you must request a specific permit to leave and enter Gaza. Will make your freedom of movement even tighter for you, limiting your movement, limiting your power. And 10 years after, the second Intifada, in 2000, erupted. Here comes Ariel Sharon again. Oh, he's moving on. Now he's prime minister. Whew. For butchering Palestinians, you can become prime minister in Israel. Oh yeah, this is definitely a normal state. So, Ariel Sharon provoked the second Intifada. Thousands of Palestinians were killed as a result. And then Ariel Sharon said, oh, no. This is too much. So what do we do with these Palestinians in Gaza? Now I'm going to invoke a little bit of religious nationalism. Gaza, by the way, all of Palestine and beyond, it's not just from the river to the sea. By the way, that's also a Likud talking point, from the river to the sea. Benjamin Netanyahu is at the head of that. No one's asking Netanyahu to change the Likud charter, right? But okay, we'll leave that aside. It's not just from the river to the sea, it's from the Nile to the Euphrates. That's what some of these religious fundamentalists, Zionists, believe. So in 2005, Ariel Sharon said, it's too much. We have 30,000 soldiers, 8,000 settlers. Well, he'll call them Jewish neighborhoods, but they're illegal settlements. Let's remove them and let's cage the people of Gaza. Dov Weisglass, who was a minister in his government, said the goal of the siege and blockade in Gaza was to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not make them die of hunger. So it's a slow death for the Palestinians. That is why the first prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, Luis Ocampo, said that the siege itself is genocide. Because we have this warped, lay understanding of genocide. It doesn't just mean thousands of limbs on the ground. It means inflicting conditions of life that are calculated to bring about the physical destruction of a people that you are targeting as such. And that's exactly what Gaza represents. You think there would be a siege and blockade if there were Jewish settlers in Gaza? There was an occupation, but the Jews that were living in Gaza, the settlers, received the same rights, the same benefits as Jewish citizens in Israel. So just because that's why there's this notion of extraterritorial application of the law. That's exactly how Israel cleverly goes around the law to present itself as believing in the rule of law. But really, you can live on the same territory, but the law does not apply to the territory. It applies to a people in the territory. And there's a hierarchy. Jewish, top, Palestinian, below. That's the values that members of Congress like to say they share with Israel. If only there was a proposition in Congress to say, we believe that those that are white or that come from certain parts of Europe should have supra-constitutional status, and those that do not should have secondary status. What if a member of Congress proposed that and asked for members of Congress to co-sponsor? What would happen to that member of Congress? Would be voted out and never to be seen again in political life. But the majority of Congress supports that in Israel, in Palestine. The hypocrisy, the utter hypocrisy of our members of Congress. And so, Gaza was turned into an open-air prison. Now we can drop bombs wherever. There's no more Jews there. So now we can drop bombs on hospitals, civilian infrastructure, schools. It doesn't matter. We're not killing our own. We're killing Palestinians. So it doesn't matter. Now we don't need specific targeting of individuals. Now we can just bomb entire neighborhoods to smithereens. And you've had massacre upon massacre upon massacre. Operation Castlet in 2008, Operation Protective Edge in 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, Operation Protective Edge in 2014, the Great March of Return in 2018, where Palestinians marched to the perimeter, asking for the end of the siege, demanding their right to return to their homes. How did Israel respond? Oh, this is so peaceful. We believe in peaceful protests. No. They brought their best trained snipers to shoot down Palestinians, and there was a huge report done by the United Nations that came to the conclusion that there's reasonable evidence to believe that Israel targeted journalists, medics, the crippled, children for marching. Not Hamas rockets, but for marching to demand what? Not to demand things that are guaranteed within a political ideology, but to demand the rights that are guaranteed under international law. So now, throughout this period of the siege, from 2007 to the present, Palestinians were put under a specific diet, were deprived of basic means, were bombed to smithereens in various massacres, and they've lived as such that whole period. And now they've realized that that's become the normal state. So what's happening now is an intensification of that. And now we're seeing a brutal genocidal campaign in Gaza. So just as a final point, if there's anything I want you to take away from this, it's this. October 7th is not the departure point of analysis. It's just one component in the entire history. And if you don't contextualize that history, you will miss the forest for the trees. And we are better than that, and we should not do that. Thank you.
First of all, thank you. Do I have to hold this thing? Oh gosh. I feel like I'm in the Vegas or something, like try the veal, it's delicious. I mean, I'm here all week. First of all, thanks. That was very moving and very powerful. And you can see why I'm an academic and you're an activist. It's not the same thing at all. It's a very, very different job description. I could not do what you do. I will say a couple of things. You're speaking in I statements, so you're giving a history, and you know your history well. But at the same time, it's your history more than I'm not Israeli, and I'm obviously not Palestinian, so it's not my history per se. So I feel a little bit. I know I'm using an I statement, Paula, but I feel a little bit weird about it. I'll say a couple of things. I don't disagree per se. Most of what you said was true. The crimes that we're seeing, which include genocide, I've written publicly that includes genocide. I didn't say that before. I disagree that it was genocide before this current attacks. But I have written that it is genocide now, not because I'm an expert in international law, which I'm not, but because international lawyers are debating it, and I was convinced by those who said it was. It's certainly apartheid. There's simply no question about that, and ethnic cleansing is clearly happening. These are all happening. There's no question about any of this, the latter two. And I don't think there's a question about genocide anymore, to be honest. There has to be restitution. There has to be an end, first of all. Then there has to be restitution. And then there has to be justice. The people who are responsible for the orders, at a minimum, have to face justice in the International Criminal Court. I don't disagree with any of that. I also don't disagree that we have, when you're talking about Palestinian experience, it doesn't matter what Martin Buber thought. That doesn't help any Palestinian sitting in the West Bank or Gaza today or in exile somewhere else. Martin Buber lost. What matters is what Zionism happened. And it might not even matter. There's work about the Zionists. You mentioned Ben-Gurion, Jabotinsky, and these people. The fact that they didn't always want this. We know that they only thought about a Jewish ethno-state from 1942. Until then, they imagined something different. I'm not sure that matters because it went the way it went. I will say a couple things as an academic for what it's worth. Colonialism is complicated. A lot of Zionism is colonialism, but it's complicated for a variety of reasons that are worth thinking about. And I would just point you all, I'm sure you know the work of Tarek Penslar at Harvard, but he's sort of the leading scholar of the connection between Zionism and colonialism, how colonialism helps us understand Zionism. It's not a question of is Zionist colonialist, and in a certain sense it clearly is, but how does the paradigm of colonialism and especially decolonialism, how does that help us now, right? How does that academic theory and that way of thinking help us approach the region now? So I would just point to his work that I think it's helpful. I agree completely that October 7th is a point, an important point, but not the first point. That's like very important. Sorry, that's a very important point. I agree completely. I will say that I don't accept, I agree that international law should be our metric. But that means that not all Palestinian resistance is legitimate, and that doesn't violate international law, right? In other words, international law also speaks to a subaltern group being oppressed by colonialism, as far as I understand. So if you think about October 7th, for example, I've said many times, people ask me about October 7th, I said if they had stopped at this uniformed soldiers, I would have been on their side publicly. I would have, by the way, come out publicly on their side. When you start killing civilians, then it becomes much more complicated. Now, you could come back and say, name me a single example of a subaltern colonized group that achieved salvation without violence that was illegal. One could say that to me and would have reason to say that to me, and I might say, I hear your point. Nevertheless, international law needs to be our backbone, it seems to me. So that's for me why I say October 7th needs to be contextualized, there needs to be a fuller history, but still it's important. And I wish that wasn't who they were, and it wasn't for me to dictate their strategies. But if only they had stopped at the uniformed soldiers, what a difference that would have made. I mean, it would. And by the way, I'm not alone. I'm not a Zionist, but I have left-wing Zionist friends, and they've told me the same thing. And these are friends who have friends with children serving in the IDF, and they told me the same thing. Killing uniformed soldiers is war, and they would have had a very different reaction. Would Israel have a different reaction? I doubt it, knowing Israel as I do. But I would have, and I think a lot of people would have, for what it's worth. So I think international law needs to be our watchword. And the same thing during the Second Intifada, right? The context matters. What was it at that point? 33 years of occupation of the West Bank, 60 years since the Nakba. This matters. But you're still not supposed to kill civilians as part of resistance. I also don't think politically it was effective because it empowered the right, but that's a different, that may not be a good reason not to do things, but that is the back of my head as well. So that was all the I statements I have. I more or less agree with everything, and I can't really compete's not the right word, but that's not my role. I'm an academic. So I try to bring, hey, did you think about this maybe? And if that helps you, that's great. And if it doesn't, it's also okay. So I'll leave it at that, and I guess we should have questions for either of us. Oh, you want to respond to that too, maybe before I promise not to respond to your response if you want to respond to my response. I promise to give you the last word if you want to say anything quickly. Let him have the last word because and I promise not to say anything.
Okay. I'll make it. You can stand. I don't know. Should I stand?
Stand. Okay. Stand. Be in the picture.
Okay. Just really quickly. I didn't want to disagree with the notion that this eventual takeover of historic Palestine the origins of it were in 1942, and I don't know, I don't think, if you want to jump in and if I'm misquoting you, but I think that's the gist of what I heard you say. In 1942, during the Biltmore Conference, I think that's what you were referring to, Ben Gurion essentially called, and the Zionist movement called for establishing a commonwealth in Palestine. But the idea was always present. It's just now it's become a formal policy of the Zionist movement. So the idea of establishing that stemmed way back. If you want to pick, everybody can pick their own starting point for the Palestinian relationship with Zionism and where it started, but I think a good starting point would be the Balfour Declaration, but you can go decades prior to that as well. But let's stick with that. The Balfour Declaration. Let's actually look at its text. If you know that Arthur James Balfour actually was the person that signed the Balfour Declaration and modified it, he was not the original author. It was not his brainchild. There were Simon and Max Nordau and others that actually put together the verbiage of the Balfour Declaration. It went through 5 different drafts, actually. Not with the actual text, but he pushed for the Balfour Declaration. I'm talking about the actual writing of the text itself. Went through 5 different drafts. Do you know what the first draft said? Palestine should be reconstituted. If you know the prefix RE, it means to make anew, to establish again. Reconstituted as the, not a national, but the national home of the Jewish people. So the desire was always for supremacy, for domination. And that's basically what apartheid is. So they realized that to get British backing, they couldn't go all the way, so they had to agree to the watered-down version, which said a national home, which left it vague, and that was basically the point of British policy. We'll leave it vague for you. So I just wanted to touch on that point. Colonialism. I think the preeminent scholar on this will be Patrick Wolf in his writings. He called it the logic of elimination. There's a reason behind that. It's because with respect to Palestine, Zionism at its core was to make sure that you establish Jewish supremacy and Jewish domination. Now, if the Palestinians had agreed, okay, we'll leave, we'll go to Yemen, okay, none of you have to die then. I'm sure that Zionists would have agreed to that, but they realized that was not going to happen. Chaim Weizmann himself said, the Palestinian natural reaction to this. Why would he use the word natural? Because he understood these are the natives. They're the owners of the land. They're not just going to up and leave. We're going to have to either bribe them, and if they're not going to accept that, we have to remove them. How? Violence is definitely implied in that. And I want to make a distinction between I wanted to make a distinction between Palestinian resistance as a right and how you carry about that resistance. That is an entirely different phenomenon. And in the context of religious nationalism as well. Religious nationalism in the service of settler colonialism is different from religious nationalism in the service of an anti-colonial struggle. One is just and one is unjust. It's that simple.
So let's just take a few questions off the floor. And please come up here. And then I want to, then we're going to hear from our last respondent. So questions from the floor. And you had a question.
Hi, my name is Nesia. I was born in Tel Aviv at 1936, then Palestine, and I'm Jewish, so I didn't become a Palestinian. But what is a Palestinian? The land was desert. There was nothing going in Israel till the Jews came there. And I suggest you read Mark Twain's visit to Israel. There was nothing there. The Jews came, and there were mosquitoes and malaria and they built the land, dried the stuff. And people from Arabs country came to Israel to work, and they stay and they became citizens. So really, like El-Matsri is an Egyptian, El-Baghdadi is from Baghdad. The responsibility should be put on the leader of the Arab country. They did nothing for them. They said when they declared the war of independence on Israel, they said to the Arab citizen, suggest that they shall leave, and when we kill all the Jews, you'll come back. This didn't happen. Not only that, they didn't let them come to the home country. So nobody talks about the responsibility of the Arab country and the Arab leaders. I wouldn't go to all the other things. Thank you.
Judge.
Shall I respond? Yeah. First of all, thank you for coming up. I know that's not an easy thing to do in this crowd, so thank you for coming up. I was born in '71. I'm middle of Gen X, so I was certainly. I'll just share an I statement. I was raised on those same stories, and there's a process of a lot of people like me, including in Israel, by the way, who have to come to terms. Unfortunately, some of those things aren't true. The land wasn't empty. There were Palestinians there. They have a national identity. By the way, I got into my work on Zionism because I was interested in Jewish nationalism as a construction of a modern construction, the same as Polish nationalism and Ukrainian nationalism. And one of the books that got me inspired to work on Zionism was Rashid Khalil's The Construction of Palestinian Nationality, because he did the same thing as I did. He said there were these pre-modern identities that were being fashioned into national identities. And he's obviously a Palestinian nationalist and a patriot. It was very important to me. So it's not to say that there were these formed nations. All nations are modern, but there were certainly Palestinians and Palestinian identity. And the problem is when you say, why don't the other Arabs help them? What you've done is you've conflated Palestinian with Arab. What you've done is elided the existence of Palestinian. Why should an Arab help them? Because they're all Arab. The argument suggests a kind of, they're all just Arab. Well, once they're all just Arab, okay, well now you have a massive Arab land. Why can't the Palestinians just go to another part of it, right? But then if you break it down and say, no, Palestinian is not the same thing as Iraqi or Syrian, now that doesn't work. And that's the reason for that story. In terms of the story of the leaders told them to flee to make room to kill the Jews, that was just a made-up story. We know that. And the people who proved that were Israelis. One of whom, by the way, is a right-winger, Benny Morris, who's a serious right-winger. And he is in the 80s. He wasn't back then, to be fair, but he is a serious right-winger who says that's just not true. I went to the archives, and some of them did flee, of course, because you flee war. Some of them fled because they heard about massacres, and some were expelled by Jews. Probably at least half were expelled by the Haganah. He says that was life. He defends it, but he doesn't deny it because he's a good historian. It was Jews who proved this already in the 80s. Now, I was born in the 70s, so I predated that, and you're a couple years older than me, so you predated that too. But my kids already knew about this stuff because it's already common knowledge. Now, what do we do with that? I do want to say in defense, there are now, again, in Israel-Palestine, 50-50 population of Jews and Palestinians. And I feel, although I am in the Jewish world hated for being so pro-Palestinian, and I am, it's not easy being Jewish and being pro-Palestinian, I can tell you from personal experience. But I still feel a need to say, there is a connection of Jews to the land. There were a lot of the Jews got there from reasons that have nothing to do with them. It was already 2 generations ago. And I'm a believer in individual rights, not national rights, in my gut of guts. I don't like thinking about collective rights as much as individual rights. And so what I want is a democracy where everyone has individual rights. And I worry about any kind of notion that, because decolonization sometimes means go home. And I don't like the idea of blood and soil nationalism. We usually think of that as a right-wing thing, blood and soil, like in Charlottesville, remember? Blood and soil. But it can also be on the left-wing thing, right? Saying, these are the indigenous should have rights, everyone else should go home. History sucks. History is terrible, especially as led by the West. But people are where they are, and we need to fight for individual rights. That's my own I statement I'll make on that, for what that's worth. And many of you may disagree about it, and that's totally fine too. Yeah. And thank you again. That was a hard thing to come up and talk, and I for one appreciate it very, very much.
I'll be very brief. I'm not going to defend Netanyahu or the current Israeli policy. And on the other hand, and I understand your passion, but you certainly emphasize certain facts and ignore other facts. And that's understandable. But I would argue that your argument is the other side of the religious Zionism. In other words, we have an area, 2 different mythologies, 7 million people living together. As Joshua said before, the only hope is that people can engage in a dialogue and interact with others and form some way to live together. And that requires common understanding. And a few points that I would like to emphasize what Nessa said there. Everybody here, Mark Twain's first bestseller was Innocents Abroad. I'm certain some of you may be familiar with. This was in the late 1870s. He went with a group of Christians to the holy sites. It was not easy, but he gives a very good description of that area. And it was filled with, it was a backwater province of the Ottoman Empire, filled with a few dirt poor Arabs, and even probably poorer Jews who were at the Western Wall. And so there's been a long history. The other thing is that you mentioned the Palestinians who left. That's certainly true, and I'm not defending it. But on the other hand, at the same time, there were more Jews who left the Arab countries, all right, and went to Israel, all right. And they were very old and well-established Jewish communities, and they were all emptied out. Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, so forth. Now, I'm not justifying what's gone on. Please, it's irrelevant, because as Joshua said, what is, what is. But I would argue that the only hope is for some common dialogue. And that has to be open. It can't be demographic. And it can't be, what can I say, totally, I'm right, you're wrong. All right. That's my plea, really.
One-liner, and you guys can do your research yourself. Mark Twain visited in the hot summer, only went to key biblical sites, and provided no statistical data whatsoever. Was that 10 seconds?
So my question is, how does colonialism and Zionism, how is that affecting our country today?
Great question.
The shot on.
How does it affect us today? It affects the way we, us in America, I mean, it affects the way we should approach that state, right? I mean, I agree with the speaker who said we have to have a conversation, but a conversation can only be based on shared facts and values, especially facts. So I think to the extent we can understand that relationship, it's useful. So that would be my answer why it matters, right? If we can understand that relationship, we'll have a better policy and a better conversation. Yeah.
So you're going to have to introduce yourself.
Of course. All right, so I want to, first of all, I just want to reduce the temperature in this room a little bit. I know a lot of opinions in the room, a lot of things to be upset about. I'm going to give you all a chance to breathe a little bit, and I'm going to introduce myself and then give you a little bit of a story about my background and what brings me here today. So my name is Rishab Chatty. As some of you might have seen my mug, I'm a bit of a transplant. I'm not from Chicago originally, but I am from California. I grew up in a suburb of Sacramento called Folsom, so I was happy to see Professor. Yeah, I grew up actually about 40 minutes away from where the professor teaches. And the demographics of the area in which I grew up in were they were Christian conservative, but also at the same time had a lot of South Asian Americans that I grew up with. In fact, my school, my middle school, my high school, even my elementary school where I grew up at in the early 2000s, was about 30% South Asian American, which was at least back in that time and then in that kind of an area quite substantial in terms of the amount of Asian American representation, Hindu American representation as well that we saw. And so I was fortunate to grow up in a family that doesn't practice Hindutva or Hindu nationalism. I was very fortunate to grow up in a rather progressive Hindu household. Although we grew up upper caste, both my parents were of different, many ethnicities within India. My mom is Gujarati, my dad is Telugu, so that's North India and South India. And so we had to kind of overcome some stereotypes in terms of quote unquote interracial or like almost intercaste marriage in a sense. Despite my parents both being of the same caste, there was a little bit of like a discrepancy in terms of who was considered almost like superior in a sense. And so we had some of these kind of difficulties we had to kind of like overgo. And so I was very fortunate to grow up in a rather progressive household. But when I would look at other households, when I would look at other South Asian Americans, Hindu Americans that I grew up with, I saw a version of Hinduism that was violent, that was very discriminatory, exclusive, right? You're looking at Hindu Americans, Hindus even in India as well, as parts of my extended family, who would say that Muslims don't belong in India, who would say that Muslims aren't Indians. In fact, I had friends who were Muslim who didn't believe that they were Indian because they had been told so frequently that you can't be Muslim and Indian. They conflated the religion of Islam with the ethnic or the national identity of India. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today. So first and foremost, so going back to my journey, I like some of the previous speakers as well, have a little bit of ADHD, so I kind of struggle a little bit with staying on track. But I saw all of this. I saw the way in which Hindus approached Hinduism around me, and I looked at myself and said, I can't identify with this, right? Like I don't believe in that. I don't believe in exclusionary policy. I don't believe in conflating your religious identity with your national identity. I don't believe in looking at somebody else as if they're lesser because of their religious identity or their religious background. And so I'm not a Hindu. I told my parents back then as well, when I was 12 years old, I came out to them as agnostic. And I told them that I didn't believe in Hinduism because that version of Hinduism that I saw, to me, that represented Hinduism, and I didn't want to associate myself with that. And so it wasn't until I read two books. The first one is called Am I a Hindu? It's a book by Ed Vishwanathan. I can write that down for you guys as well, if you'd like. And in that book, I'll talk a little bit about that itself in the future as well. It talks a lot about how in Hinduism, you're encouraged not to just look at Hindu texts, not just look at the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and other scriptures, but also to look at the Quran, to look at the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, look at any other religious text and take what you want to or what you can learn from them and incorporate that into your daily life. It encourages you to look at other religions. So that was the first book I read kind of on Hinduism that kind of like got my mind thinking a little bit more. And then in college, I read the Bhagavad Gita. I went to Arizona State University. I went to university where I was very surprised that we were encouraged to read the Bhagavad Gita in our classes, but when I actually read the text, I started to see a little bit more about what principles I wanted to embody in my life, and that's what brought me back to Hinduism, going into college and coming back into grad school. So now I've given you a little bit about my background. Now today I stand before you as the chapter co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights in Chicago. I'm a research fellow with the South Asian American Coalition to Renew Democracy. I'm a graduate student at the University of Chicago. Though not as much of an academic as the professor here was. Don't have that kind of charisma. I'm not going to be able to come at you, and I don't have the public speaking skills that some of our previous speakers had. So pardon me if I'm going to be looking at my phone quite a bit for notes here. And I didn't include this in my bio, but I'm also associate director at the Crane Center for Mass Atrocity Prevention. So I do have a bit of a background in international human rights advocacy. I've done some stuff in regards to looking at how to end genocides ongoing, not only in Palestine, but in the Congo, in Sudan, in Burma, in Xinjiang of China, etc. So now coming to today's discussion, I want to start off by kind of talking a little bit more about what is Hindutva, right? We're hearing this term being thrown around quite a bit. We're hearing the term Hindu nationalism thrown around a little bit. So I want to kind of clarify what Hindutva is. So just like how Christian nationalism is not Christianity, Zionism is not Judaism, Hindutva is not Hinduism, right? Hindutva is a religious nationalism. It's an ethno-religious nationalism that it's vastly different than Hinduism. What Hinduism preaches, it's a beautiful religion that preaches, and I'm just going to name a few of the core tenets here. Number one, ahimsa, non-violence, which is fundamentally different than what Hindutva preaches. Satyagraha, holding firmly to truth. Seva, selfless service. And Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the world is one family. It is encouraged, as I said before, that one who's practicing Hinduism look at other faiths and religions and incorporate the teachings of each into their lives. It is my personal opinion, I believe, again, I believe that Hinduism is almost more of a philosophy than a traditional religion. Hindutva, on the other hand, is a political and cultural ideology that ties Indian identity to Hinduism. So if you're Indian, you're Hindu. If you're Hindu, you're Indian. It erases the cultures and identities of Muslims, Sikhs, Jains, Christians, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, and so many other religious and ethnic identities that coexist, for the most part, peacefully within India. Reverend Cook spoke about how Christian nationalism permeates American politics by the way of the White House and I would say the Republican Party in the US. Hindutva similarly rears its ugly head by way of the Modi regime and the BJP political party, which shares many characteristics with MAGA in the US, the Tories in the UK, AFD in Germany, and other far-right authoritarian movements in Hungary, Poland, and all over the world. Now, the term Hindutva was coined by Vinayak D. Sadhwarkar, a man who openly and frequently praised fascism in Germany and Hitler and equated Indian Muslims with German Jews. This was back in the 1930s and 1940s. So, looking at the connection between Hindutva and Zionism, right? Like now we're going to talk a little bit more about how these two ideologies are connected. Now, both are ethno-religious nationalisms, right? But Savarkar supported the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Germany. He also supported the idea of a Jewish state. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, right? In his book, Essentials of Hindutva, Savarkar wrote, and I quote, "If the Zionist dreams are ever realized, if Palestine becomes a Jewish state, it will gladden us almost as much as our Jewish friends," unquote. He believed that like Jews, Hindus deserve their own homeland. Now, let me introduce you to another one of India's less commendable productions, M.S. Golwalkar. Golwalkar was another father of Hindutva ideology and one of the earliest leaders of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS. For those of you who don't know, the RSS is a far-right Hindu nationalist volunteer paramilitary organization, and among its finest productions is India's current Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was part of the RSS when he was younger. He had a vision of, and this is about Golwalkar, he had a vision of a Hindu Rashtra, or a Hindu nation, that he modeled based on the reconstruction of the Jewish nation in Palestine. In his book, We or Our Nationhood, he wrote, quote, "The Jews had maintained their race, religion, culture, and language. All they wanted was their natural territory to complete their nationality. The reconstruction of the Hebrew nation in Palestine is just an affirmation of the fact that country, race, religion, culture, and language must exist unavoidably together to form a full nation idea." Now, I know I just threw at you a bunch of historical mumbo-jumbo and a name that I frankly also struggle to memorize, which is why I'm looking at my phone right now. But let me be a little bit more direct as to the connection between both Hindutva and Zionism. So number one, both Hinduism and Zionism have established an other. Hindu nationalists ostracize Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and other religious minorities, while Zionists do the same with Palestinians, or more broadly speaking, Arabs and Muslims. In both ideologies, there's a nation defined by historic people there's a nation defined by historic people on a historic land, not merely by citizenship. So Tarek over here talked a little bit about that. Both are grounded in Islamophobia, and as I'll dive into shortly, justify violence and oppression against Muslims in Palestine and Muslims in Kashmir, using war and terror language. Similarly to how the United States justified violence against Iraqis, Afghanis, Syrians, etc., using the same kind of language. And both are ethno-religious nationalisms with foundations in exclusivism and supremacy. I could just drone on and on about the connections here, but let's look at the practical expressions of this connection, right? I think one of the previous questions asked about the modern manifestations of the tie between colonialism and Zionism, right? So going into how do we see this in our lives today, right? I can assure you the connection between both Hinduism and Zionism is alive as ever, and it's especially manifested itself in the form of the relationship between Israel and India today. So Ariel Sharon, as I think one of our previous speakers talked about a little bit, came into power by brutalizing Palestinians. Modi, similarly, has been called the butcher of Gujarat for the slaughter of Muslims in the Indian state of Gujarat in 2002. So for those of you who didn't know, who don't know, Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat, a very prominent state in India, before he became the prime minister. And during his time there, he oversaw the brutal slaughter of thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Muslims in the state, which has a very significant Muslim population. So he came to power in a very similar sense as Prime Minister Sharon did. India is the largest recipient of Israeli arms sales. I think my good friend Neil here said I think it was the second largest. I believe they've now become the largest. Importing about $5 billion in Israeli arms and surveillance systems since 2002. Under Modi's leadership, India has supplied rocket engines, explosives, and other military supplies to support Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. India contains the only facility that manufactures Hermes 900 drones, which have been used to murder children in Gaza for almost 2 decades. The Human Rights Watch report about this. That facility belongs to a company called Adani Elbit Advanced Systems India, a joint drone production partnership between the Adani Group, which is owned by Gautam Adani, the second richest man in India, and a close ally to Modi, and Elbit Systems, which is the largest conventional arms manufacturer in Israel. India's report repeatedly abstained from UN ceasefire votes, calling for an end to the genocide in Gaza. India uses drones and small arms acquired from Israel to conduct surveillance, and in Kashmir, India also uses a smart fence system developed by Israel on the line of control. In 2022, the New York Times reported that Israel sold Pegasus, an Israeli software that the Israeli government only sells to other governments, to India in 2017. Both governments deny this, but hundreds of Indians, including ministers, opposition leaders, political strategists, journalists, Supreme Court judges, election commissioners, and heads of the Indian Central Bureau of Investigation, which is similar to our FBI, have been targeted by the spyware. Police in Delhi, which is one of the largest cities in India, rely on technology developed by an Israeli company called Celebrite to extract data from phones. And this has been mainly applied in the context of targeting Muslims who are protesting against the Modi regime. Like how the US sends police officers to Israel to train, India does the same to train police officers in counterinsurgency tactics, intelligence, and urban policing, teaching Indian police occupation-style techniques for domestic policing. In 2019, Israel's consul general in New York, in the US, publicly endorsed applying a, quote, Israeli model in Kashmir. Now, kind of like, again, we're going to talk a little bit more about the United States, right? The Hindu American Foundation, the largest Hindu advocacy group in the US, has cooperated closely with Jewish pro-Israel organizations like the ADL. It models its political playbook on Zionist movements using defense such as Hinduphobia, similarly to how Zionist groups frame anti-Semitism. A lot of documented instances of Hindutva-aligned groups like the Hindu American Foundation, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, which is, by the way, an organization that's been designated by CIA as a militant Hindu nationalist organization. Many connections and many collaborations between these groups and Christian Zionist groups, including AIPAC and other organizations like that. In the form of co-sponsoring pro-Israel rallies, coordinating political efforts to challenge U.S. progressives critical of other ideologies. So we're looking at Jamal Bowman, for example. We're looking at attacks against Ilhan Omar, Summer Lee, etc. Now, I want to end on one particular organization, right? So have any of you heard of the Republican Hindu Coalition?
No, usually it's Democrats.
Yeah, so it's a good point here. Indian Americans actually predominantly vote, for the most part, for Democrats, but there's a very prominent organization called the Republican Hindu Coalition, which is based in Illinois, in a suburb of Chicago. It's modeled after the Republican Jewish Coalition. And does anyone want to guess which significant political leader in the United States is the co-chair of the Republican Hindu Coalition? Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is the co-chair of the Republican Hindu Coalition. Now, that itself is the clearest, in my opinion, is the clearest denotation of the relationship between Hindutva, Christian nationalism, and Zionism, right? You have a Republican Hindu coalition based off of the Republican Jewish coalition with a co-chair named Steve Bannon, who is both, in my opinion, a Nazi and also a Christian nationalist, all coming together in one organization. And so I think that's the clearest way I can kind of frame the way in which Hindutva intersects with Zionism.
Thank you so much. Again, I'm Paula, and I'm United Methodist in the Northern Illinois Conference, so we get the last word. I regret that we didn't have more time to have that in-depth conversation that we were going to ask of you, but we are out of time. You're free to stay a little bit late and talk amongst yourselves. There's more food left. But I have two things that I want to say, or actually three things. One, as United Methodists, I really ask us to look at the social principles, to look at what Church and Society put out with respect to the faith and facts, understanding the United Palestinian territories, of which I have some copies over there. And also to pay attention to what our bishop's statement was most recently with respect to that press release. But I do have two asks of you. One is from the bishop, all right? And so when I talked about that press release and why I thought it was important, what the CIOGC and the Northern Illinois Conference was asking of faith groups is to select a day of fast and encourage congregants to join the fast in solidarity with the people of Gaza. 2, on the day of fast, ask congregants to send letters to their local and national elected officials reciting the joint statement's demands, and we will make copies of this statement available through the Social Justice Committee intersections, and we want to thank them very much. And 3, make this fight to stop the starvation in Gaza the regular subject of worship services.